Before I say anything, let me get this out of the way. I have zero nostalgia for Spyro. I've always been more of a Nintendo kid growing up. I got a Super Nintendo when I was 3, then I got a GameCube, then a GBA, DS, Wii, and so on. So my nostalgia for video games lies almost entirely within that Nintendo sphere I was in for the first 10 or so years of my life. Despite this, I remember renting Spyro Enter the Dragonfly from Blockbuster when I was little. This was my first exposure to any Spyro game, and it was forgettable. I honestly remember nothing about it. I don't think I played it very much while I had it rented out anyways. This brings me to the Spyro Reignited Trilogy. When it was announced and released, I felt nothing. I was excited for fans of the series, sure, but I didn't care much about the game myself. That is, until it dropped to $12 on a humble monthly along with Crash and a game I'll never ever install. So I installed Spyro and left it in my Steam library for a few days. Then, on a lazy Sunday morning, I decided to pop it in, metaphorically of course, and play it. And for the next 4 hours, I almost felt like a kid again. Spyro the Dragon is a 3D platformer from the 90s, so as expected, its plot is nothing special. It's hardly even worth mentioning in this review. In a TV interview about the state of the dragon world, a dragon calls the main villain Nasty Nork ugly. By the way, a Nork is a cross between an orc and a gnome. He waves his staff and turns each dragon, except for Spyro, into crystal from the comfort of his own home. So Spyro has to save the dragons and get their treasure back. That's it. That's the plot. A 1 minute long, skippable cutscene at the very beginning, and the game sets you off on your journey. The gameplay of Spyro the Dragon is extremely pure and soaked with classic 3D platforming that just feels good. You play as Spyro, a dragon with horns. The entire game revolves around this fact, as Spyro's 3 main abilities are ramming, gliding, and breathing fire. You can't get new abilities, but as it turns out, they aren't needed. This game does a fantastic job of squeezing every last bit out of these 3 things that Spyro can do. It teaches the player how to use these abilities organically, that is, through forced experimentation. For example, in the very first area, there's an enemy that runs away from the player, too fast for Spyro to catch normally. This forces the player to experiment with the buttons and learn that there's a dash function. Using this rams Spyro into the enemy and visibly hurts it. It runs in a new direction, giving the player a chance to try controlling the dash a bit better. This first open area acts as a playground for the player to test out these abilities and get acquainted with them, not unlike Super Mario 64's iconic Castle Grounds area. Overall, the game is easy. It's not nearly as difficult as other 3D platformers from the 90s, such as Crash Bandicoot or even the later stages of Super Mario 64. There's a ton of open space to explore, and enemies, even bosses, rarely pose as any sort of a real threat. They essentially act as just minor annoyances. There is one exception to this, however: the flight levels. These levels are tough. You need to complete various tasks in a level where you can properly fly within a time limit. These tasks include things like flying through rings or destroying enemy planes. Completing the tasks by themselves aren't very difficult, but the hard part is the fact that you need to complete every task in one run of the level under the time limit. I haven't been able to clear all the flight levels in full. Despite being hard as nails compared to the rest of the game, these flight levels do provide even more variety to the gameplay. As you can clearly tell from the footage on screen, this game is dummy thick. That is, it's absolutely gorgeous. In every level, there are a huge amount of details that simply weren't present in the original. Its style is similar to the newer Ratchet & Clank or the Crash Bandicoot Insane trilogy in that it looks like an animated movie. Each of the dragons you rescue look completely different from one another, with their design and animations looking great. The short cutscenes you get from rescuing them act as a nice reward for doing so. From a performance perspective, the game runs great. All of the footage you see was captured from the PC version of the game, with the GTX 1070 graphics card, I was able to hit a consistent 60 FPS 1080p at max settings. Turning off VSync would get me anywhere between 90 and 144 FPS depending on the area, but for most single player experiences like this, I prefer the consistency that VSync brings. Ignoring the benefits that the portable Switch version brings to the table, the PC version looks to be the definitive way to play the game versus the 30 FPS of the console versions. Graphics quality is also adjustable to fit your system, but I would recommend playing at medium settings or higher since the lighting in low seems to be really wonky. The sound of this game is really good too. Sound effects fit whatever is happening just fine, and the soundtrack is quite good as well. None of the tracks have really stuck with me after beating the game, but it is great within the context of the levels. The Reignited version of Spyro the Dragon has a different soundtrack than the PS1 original, but there is an option to have the classic soundtrack. As someone who didn't play the original, I didn't end up using this option at all. The voice acting of each unique dragon sounds great. Tom Kenny, the voice of SpongeBob, actually voices Spyro in this game.
Where's Nasty Nort? I'll torch him!
The sound that the egg thieves make are incredibly annoying, but it's meant to be that way. Every time I hear that goddamn sound, it makes me want to corner the little bastard. Spyro the Dragon was a joy to play, and I'm glad I took the time to experience it. It's seeping with classic 3D platforming action, and even with zero nostalgia goggles over my eyes, it's still a fantastic game that should be played by anyone who is a fan of 3D platformers. My only complaint is that it's a very easy and short game. However, that makes this a very relaxing and laid-back game to play. It took me about 4.5 hours to beat, and that is after nabbing most of the collectibles. I haven't 120%ed the game yet, but I probably will in the future.